organisation. STEP evolved from what was the Association of Chartered Teachers in 2014, and we are an independent, non-affiliated, grassroots organisation comprising classroom teachers who organise career-long professional learning for other teachers. The STEP committee members come from a wide range of backgrounds, experiences and different education sectors. Our spring conference is normally the highlight of our calendar, but in recent years we've hosted Sir John Jones and Claire Lavelle from the Hive of Wellbeing. Current circumstances have, shall we say, encouraged us to move online, but our feedback from delegates suggest that they can't wait for us to get back to meeting our colleagues in person. So I first attended the STEP annual conference in 2015, and after attending for 3 years, I joined the committee, and since then we have experienced Snowmageddon and now a global pandemic, both of which have delayed our conference, and yet the committee have asked me to host this first online event, and if that's not teacher optimism for you, I'm not sure what is. So now this is usually the bit where I ask people and encourage people to join as new committee members, but I'm very pleased to say that the committee is currently full and that all the committee members work together to provide tonight's event. And you can continue to get involved with STEP and support us through Facebook, Twitter and by attending our other events. So if you have any questions tonight, if you can pop those into the chat or use the Menti code, and members of the committee will be monitoring that tonight. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce a man who arguably needs no introduction. I know that many of you have come along tonight because you've heard David before, and you're more than willing, even in these challenging times or because of these challenging times, to listen to him once again. So a very brief background: David was Director of Children's Services for Stirling Council, and before that Head of Education East Lothian. He's had roles in quality assurance and responsibility for curriculum development. David has worked at all levels, from classroom to involvement in policy. But very importantly, whatever he's done and wherever it's taken him, David's not forgotten what the lived experience of a classroom teacher is. And he never underestimates the impact that things have on classroom teachers. So most, if not all of you, know and respect David because of this, and it's no doubt why this event was fully subscribed so quickly. So the STEP committee have said it before, but I'll repeat it now, that we're very grateful for your support, David, in the past and as we move forward. As I mentioned, in recent years, David has generously hosted our annual conference, but now it's my turn to hand over to him and to allow you to be silently welcomed by your very eager audience. So, David.
Hello.
Hello.
Right, I'm just feeling absolutely, totally embarrassed here because that is such a build-up. And I have done all that stuff, but I'm over it now, and it's wonderful that the next person you're going to have on has actually been appointed. My last career move was to get sacked, so you know it's kind of swings and roundabouts here.
Right. I am going to fully hand over. Sorry, I'm going to just fully hand over to you and vanish myself from the screen. Thank you.
Excellent. Right, there we go. So yeah, I mean this is a proper treat. Because let's face it, I don't get out much these days, but then, you know, nobody does. And there's going to be an awful lot of recycling in this. I just need to be absolutely honest with you about that, because there are points that I just really, really want to make, and there are points I really want to stress. So, am I sharing the screen? Can you see my screen?
We are seeing you so far.
Oh, right. Let's see if we can. How's that? Here's the title.
No, we're still good. Well, I've still got you.
Oh, I've got you, babe. We sound like Sonny and Cher. Hold on. Let me go back and see if I do share screen. And there we go.
That's you.
Are we in business now?
Yep, perfect.
Right, here's the title. Inspired by colloquial Scottish. I was in the supermarket the other day and I heard a wee kid going, "Dad, Dad, Dad, I found the party food." And his dad said, "I'll give you party food. I'll party food you right out that window." And that pretty much is my response to the new normal. Because let's face it, guys, we're in a stage where everything appears to be changing. And then we need a bit of David Bowie. Because when everything changes, we need to ask. Still don't know what I was waiting for. Because that's the feeling we get. That's the feeling we get, that everything's changed. It's been abject chaos, I think. And this presentation, especially for you, if you never want to hear the phrase new normal again. I mean, it's just another of these cliches that keep coming at us almost as rapidly as infographics. Because everybody's screaming out for infographics, aren't we? It's what we need to solve all of our problems. And the whole idea of new normal is a kind of contradiction in terms, isn't it? So it's also for you if the thought of reinventing education again evokes the cry of gay as peace, because frankly, I've heard it so often recently. There have been so many webinars on reinventing education, and they all fail to recognise one simple thing, which is pretty much that everybody's absolutely knackered. And it's for you if you think that. Because it does feel like COVID-19 could bring overwork quicker than it brings intensive care, really. And if you think that politicians should be vaccinated with reality rather than against coronavirus, this is definitely for you. So with all of that in the background, let's have a look at what the COVID reality has been. And that's the real reality, because one of my big beefs at the moment is that schools appear to me to have been cloaked in like a total veil of invisibility. And people are simply not recognising what's going on. There's a kind of, if I shut my eyes, a bit like Francis Drake, and look down the wrong end of the telescope or whatever, everything will be fine. And it's not fine. It's been like a game of buckaroo, and I stole that phrase from a business manager that I worked with in England. But if you're old enough to remember buckaroo, it's where you had to load stuff onto a mule, and if you got it wrong, it bucked everything off. And it feels to me that that's what life's been like for schools and teachers since the beginning of this pandemic, that stuff's just been getting loaded on and on and on. And as more and more's got loaded on, I think there's a risk that more and more has been bucking off. And actually, I think to the credit of schools, there's been less getting bucked off than should have been getting bucked off. Because for me, the pressures have just been absolutely enormous. And we've got all of that, haven't we? We've had changing rules, varying guidance. Any guidance we get tends to arrive too late, change too quickly. We're continually being rerouted. It's not been as bad in Scotland, if I'm honest, as it's been in England. And I know we've got somebody from Cumbria with us tonight. And my God, what England's been going through is unbelievable. I just love the fact that on Sunday schools were safe and on Monday there were cesspits. It is just like being caught in the spin cycle, a washing machine at the moment. But even in Scotland, I think it's felt like that. And especially around assessment and certification. So we've had all of that going on. And the whole assessment business has just been an absolute hokey-cokey, isn't it? I loved it when we were all completely unfit to pass judgment on our children. And we needed algorithms or whatever the hell people were coming up with to get an appropriate decision on the grades that children should have in our schools. And I recognise there are problems with teacher assessment, but nobody talks about it all the rest of the time when the assessment decisions that you're making are at the absolute core of your planning for children. If we can't assess effectively, we can't plan next steps because we're building everything on a false foundation. So we need to recognise there are skills in assessment, which we've done precious little to encourage. And it's fascinating that we've done so little in the last few months to try and enhance consistency around assessment, if that's a problem. So we've had all of that reality going on, if you like, and we've now got a frozen screen. Don't know why. Let's see what I can do about that. There we go. And there's the reality we've also now got. Right, for schools that are functioning, from those that I've spoken to, and it's not 100% survey, it's not waterproof, it's not bulletproof, it's not any kind of proof, but this is what I'm picking up. That in schools, pupil absences are absolutely shooting holes in the possibility of continuity anyway. And people go into meltdown at the possibility of schools closing, but they don't recognise just how disruptive the experience for teachers and students is, regardless of whether children are in or not. We've got staff absences. And again, what that does is that's created a lack of continuity, it's created additional pressures, it's created all sorts of problems and difficulties within schools. And set against that, obviously, we've got parental concerns. Either they're getting too much stuff to do or they're not getting enough to do or whatever. But the pressures and concerns from parents have been enormous. And again, my feeling is that somebody could actually do with bucking off. Because frankly, the situation that we're in at the moment, even with schools closed down, it appears to me to be intolerable. And as we do all of that, and again, apologies for the technology not cooperating as it should, here's a few more realities that we're dealing with. And they're very real. And there they are. And oddly enough, some of you will have recognised that that's exactly the same slide that I've just switched off, except it's got continuous disruption added. So apologies for that. But we are also, I think, and this is worth adding to the previous slide, we're also continually picking up the pieces. Because for lots of young people, they've been coming into schools, bringing tensions, bringing pressures, bringing anxieties. We've had lots of schools where parents have been making contacts. Schools have become one of the rocks, I think, that people have relied on. And I noted on Twitter the other night, a school noting how many calls they had made to parents. And that whole business of picking up the pieces, obviously exemplified by the average white man, right there and there, is so difficult because it increases stress and pressure. So my question, and I can't get into chat to look at what you're saying about it at the moment, my question is this how it is for you? Is this what it feels like for you? Because certainly this is what I'm picking up from all of the people that I'm talking to. And the main thing, and it's a phrase that I've used a lot in presentations, the main thing for me is that in schools, the tyranny of the immediate has just gone absolutely over the top. And I talk about this in normal terms. I talk about the period when I was a depute and I used to sit every Friday afternoon religiously. I'd draw up my to-do list for the week. There would be 40, 50 things on it. I'd go in on Monday, brown-haired, full of energy, unwrinkled. I look like I do now, only ironed. I'd go in, I'd work my way through the week in an absolute blaze of energy and enthusiasm. I'd get to Friday afternoon, and Friday afternoon I'd get out my to-do list to tick off all the many things I'd accomplished in the week. And I'd get about 4. And what I used to do was I used to write in new things that I had actually done during the week, just so I'd have something to tick off. And I could go into the weekend feeling a bit better about myself. I cannot imagine how much we have ramped up that tyranny of the immediate in terms of the current situation. And it's so difficult, isn't it? It's so dominating in terms of how we operate. Because in the situation that lots of people have been in, we don't have time to think. And who knows what's going to be served up next? And I said clearly that the situation in Scotland appeared to me to be better than the situation in England. But we've still got that gentleman in charge. We've still got that characteristic leadership at UK level. Where, as I said, you can change your mind in less than 24 hours about something as significant as school openings. My favourite tweet of the week was somebody said that they wished that Nicola Sturgeon would resign, not because they wanted rid of her, but because they knew Boris Johnson would then have to do it 2 days later. And that's the reality that people are dealing with. So is it your reality? And there are your options, yes, no, or partly. Because if they are, then I think what we need to do all the time is remind ourselves that this is not new. And I've said this before, but this is what you've been doing for a very long time.
I keep a close watch on this heart of mine. I keep my eyes wide open all the time. I keep the ends out for the tide that binds.
And I make no apology for repeating this, because I do think that we need to remind ourselves that in the midst of the chaos and the additional demands and everything else, there was a reality which existed before. And it was a walk in the line reality. And there we are. And that's the reality, I think. These are the lines that we were walking before, and all of that's been exacerbated as we've moved through the pandemic. And that's what drew the lines. And again, we've spoken about this before with some of you, but the complexity that we're dealing with in terms of young people is now unparalleled. And the example that I always gave was when I started teaching, ADHD hadn't been invented, so nobody could have it. And now we expect a new condition to be diagnosed at lunchtime and 14 kids to have it by 1:30 in the afternoon. A queue of parents outside the head's office by the end of the day, wanting to know what you're going to do about it. And that complexity around young people has increased. You know, again, when I started, there was no such thing as the EpiPen. If a kid kicked off, you just stab them with a biro and hope for the best. So we've got all of that stuff that's been going on for ages. But I now think that our communities are even more complex. And when I've talked about that on previous occasions, I've talked about the increasing diversity in communities, the increasing number of languages, the increasing mix that we've faced in terms of people coming in. But I think our communities are even more complex and fragmented now. And I think the pandemic has brought that out. This has been, for me, one of the worst years of division in this country, whether you define this country as Scotland or the UK. And people feel it's okay to be polarised. People feel it's okay to be demanding. People feel it's okay to put pressures on. And we've got all of that at the same time that we've had a massive increase in problems with mental health and anxiety. And that's been for our students, that's been for pupils in their schools, but it's also been for families. And I think lots of you are picking up the backwash of that. And that's created even greater complexity in terms of the context in which we work. Because while schools have become more and more difficult to manage and more diverse, I think, over the years, I think what we're now facing is a shifting sands phenomenon where we don't have that continuity. It's the point I was trying to make earlier about the impact of absence and disruption and uncertainty. And all of these things have gone on, and there really has been no lack of demand. I mean, one of the things I don't understand is why people have kept blathering on about catch-up, when the finishing lines that people are catching up to are actually under the control of government and the education system. There is no natural physical law which says that children all have to be classified, certificated, stamped, and into the system by August. If we can change terms in schools, we can change them in universities, and we are failing to move in terms of these demands. So what I think you're experiencing is a constant intensification of pressure in that. And we know perfectly well that the system has been fragmenting for some time. You know, I remember I worked in Edinburgh at one stage, and the advisory service needed a building to house them that's now become an art gallery. There were sodding hundreds of them. And I was one, so I make no apology for that. But that support was there in virtually every authority in Scotland. That just simply doesn't exist anymore. We've had this going for some time, a recruitment crisis. You know, that idea, if you see a maths teacher, photograph them, you never know when another one might come along. My standard joke about asking head teachers if they've got selection processes for supply staff and being told that they sometimes check for a pulse. So we've had all of that going on for some time, and now I am seeing more and more people either giving up or being on the point of giving up because of the experience that they're currently having. And that's set in the context of funding issues. And again, we've probably spoken about this with some of you before, but we've had that whole idea that, you know, raising attainment fund, which is apparently putting additional money into schools at exactly the point that the money's been taken out at the level of the local authority. So a lot of the additional funding, to me, is completely illusory. So that's what we've been dealing with. And we've had a few issues for some time about morale. And I am just amazed at the way that teachers are able to bounce back. You know, the fact that we get a full house for something like tonight and folk actually turn up for it is just remarkable to me. And that says so much about you and who you are. Because again, let's remind ourselves. And that's the reality that we've been talking about for some time. You know, my quote, again, many of you will have seen it before, about being a head teacher being like pecked to death by hens. Everybody can have a go at them. And lots of them will pass that down like zombies in The Walking Dead to anybody that happens to be in the establishment. So all of that pressure, you know, I think you guys are a bit like the kidneys of the system. Everything has to pass through you before it comes out the other side. And that sense that if it's not coming down on you from above, it's coming up at you from below. You know, that just again is another thing that's been absolutely intensified through the pandemic. We've done so little in real terms to enable meaningful use of online learning. We are prepared for the past and not the future. And now we're picking up the tab for that. And the whole thing that we've seen this week of systems that are incapable of bearing the burden put on them is just a really good illustration, I think, of what it feels like. And that feeling that I've described as having a shower and a douche at the same time, you know, I mean, there's a certain warmth around it, but it's not necessarily a pleasant one. And that's the change. And again, you know, you'll have seen this before, lots of you, but that's the change that we've seen. That's how things used to be. Schools used to be mainly under the control of the head, the remit of the senior leadership team, fairly clear and straightforward. There's what you're doing now. Everything is the school's responsibility. And you will be asked to pick up the tab on mental health, anxiety, disruption, and inequality once we get through the period of the pandemic. You know, it's that classic thing that I've talked about before, that if you could find your way to defeat terrorism and extremism in the morning, and then make sure that we catch up in the PISA tables in the afternoon, and in the meantime provide mental health support, well-being, resilience, and everything else, if you could manage to do all of that, you know, we'd be really grateful to you. Only nobody's really grateful to you. It tends to be taken for granted and accepted. And we've also got this, haven't we? We've also got a clear situation. You can pick up the lyrics.
We're on the trail. I can't walk down because I love you too much, baby. Why can't you see what you're going to be? When you don't believe what I say, we can go on together with suspicious mind.
And that's the bit I was waiting for, the suspicious mind bit. Because there's no backtracking on accountability, is there? There's no lowering of the stakes, and we talked about it earlier. There's an increase in demand rather than a lowering of the stakes. And what we need at the moment is some clarity around what expectations are. The reality, I think, is that youngsters and families will survive this. You know, that we will get back on track. You'll make sure that we get back on track. But for the love of God, let's make it a bit easier for you. And let's stop all of this, you know, this constant vocabulary of exhortation that I've talked about before. You know, this irritating cult of perfection, this refusal to recognize that education is messy and difficult at the best of times. And it's horrendously messy and difficult right now. And the idea of 57 varieties of improvement, you know, I've talked about it already, the onslaught of the infographics, you know, the whole idea of refreshing the narratives, classically part of this. You don't really have a problem. You've just been listening to the wrong story. If we just tell it differently, I'll be fine. And here's some new slides. And that recognition sits along my bête noire, as many of you will know, the exhortation to work smarter. And I've told many, many people, best piece of advice I ever give, if anybody ever tells you to work smarter, just reach out, grab the loose clothing on the upper part of their body, pull them sharply towards you and whack your forehead right into the bridge of their nose. Because nobody in my experience gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to work more, stupid. And yet that's the kind of nonsense that we're subjected to. We need more than patronisation, because that's what it's doing to you. And I think this slide needs to be changed, because with COVID, I think the right-hand part in my side of it needs to be moved to Tuesday or even Monday afternoon. I think some people are actually starting the week like that and never getting much better with it. I don't know why that's there, but let's just skip that. And some of us are getting this.
Who's that shadow holding me hostage? I've been here for days. Who's this with?
I'm not putting that too strongly, but there is a sense, the idea of Stockholm syndrome, that we become almost inured to the situations that we find ourselves continually in. And we almost accept it. I mean, it's just really intriguing, some of the feedback I'm seeing in meetings that people are having. Because here's the real reality. You're still here. You're doing CPD. It's night time. You're doing it in your own time. You're still here. You're still committed. And when you've got the opportunity to influence it, children are still learning. And it's interesting because we've had all sorts of discussions about home learning and how that works. And some of the best home learning I've seen has been based in Glenrothes around Homestart, where one of the workers has been putting out homemade YouTube videos, giving all sorts of ideas to parents for activities that they can engage in with children. And some children who weren't engaging at school, who were alienated in classrooms, are actually making a bit of progress with their parents. And I say that not in any way as a criticism of schools, but it's about time, isn't it? You know, so much of learning is about engagement, and that possibility for engagement is still there. And that's my big message about tonight, that coping is achieving. It's not about pursuing excellence right now. It's not about stretching further. And again, one of the things that I'm concerned about just now is that there's too much stretching going on. You know, I'm struck just now that actually I'm seeing less people with cold. Well, I'm not seeing anybody, but you know, my experience is that there are less colds around, that there's less normal flu around, that people, if they don't have COVID, they're tending not to be ill unless they've got a significant underlying condition or an ongoing illness or whatever. And it's almost as if people are girding up their loins to deal with the pandemic. And my worry is that if we reach a point with vaccination or whatever else, and we reach a point where there is some kind of recognisable past reality coming back, that all of that will catch up. Because that's the best that we can do, I think, is to cope. And I think people have achieved really well. You know, I think we do need to recognise just how significant that's been. But we need to go back, and again, this is going back and repeating messages that people have had in the past. We need to go back and recognise that we're going to get cynicism. You know, we're going to get people coming back saying, what a mess, we were let down, all of that. We're going to get more people leaving. That problem that we've got of people working harder than they ever did has become worse, hasn't it? You know, I've used the story continually about the Derby heads and the head teacher sitting, very imposing figure sitting there. And I was saying, how many of you are letting your work invade your life? You know, for example, how many of you have got a partner that you promise to love and to honour and to worship with your body? And this woman went, no, during term time I didn't. And I felt there was some real truth in that was the way life was becoming for lots and lots of people engaged in teaching and education. More work, more anxiety, more neglect for other things and other people, more neglect for our own well-being, the wider aspects of our life, stress as an almost constant factor. And again, many of us self-medicating through alcohol, which I think is no bad thing in some ways, but, you know, please at least put it in a glass rather than go straight to the bottle. And if we're not going to fall into all of these traps, then I think the messages that we need to go back to are messages that we've talked about before. And that's the message that I've kept giving conference after conference this step, that we need to agree what matters. We need to identify what the things are that actually make a difference. And I think the harsh light of the pandemic has probably helped us to see what mattered during that period. It may have given us a sharpness and a clarity that allow us to be much more assertive about what's important. And we certainly need to agree what the breakable plates are, because I suspect that loads of them have got broken in the experience that we've gone through. And we need to stop and say, which ones did we miss? Because if we didn't have the subtraction habit before, we need it now. We need, again, to start saying, what are we going to stop doing? What are we going to do less of? Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to step back up in the way that we might need to if we ever get through the situation that we're in. But that's the critical message for me, that we can't let going beyond become the new normal. And there's such a risk of that, isn't it? That what we do is we gradually get caught up in that Stockholm syndrome thing, where the demands that are on us that are utterly unreasonable become habit. And that's what the new normal is in danger of becoming. That we're expected to keep stepping up in the way that we have through a period of crisis. We can't keep doing that. So let's go back to the principles that we've enshrined. The first being manageability. We need continually to ask the question, what can we do? Not what should we do, not what must we do, but what can we do? Because if we don't ask that, we get ourselves into the redlining situation that we're in so much. You know, and the question that I often ask in these contexts is how many people are ill during the holidays? Because that's a standard thing to see with teachers, that people draw a breath at the start of the term and then get their head down and hope that they make it to Christmas or half term or whatever. And it's when we get the holidays that the systems collapse, that we allow ourselves to become ill. More than anything, we need to say what is manageable and what will be manageable in a phase of recovery, which is what will follow from the pandemic. And in that phase of recovery, coherence becomes an absolute essential. We cannot go on with this continual sense of switching from one priority to another. We need to be clear in our schools about what it is that we believe will make the difference. What are the pillars on which we will build recovery, improvement, and change? And I don't care whether that's about knowledge, I don't care whether it's about independent learning, I don't care whether it's about creativity. I just feel that people need the solidity and foundations on which they can stand. We have had enough of disruption. And we need consonance. We need to be allowed to build forward from our ambitions, which means continuing the discussions that STEP are so good at creating around establishing what our ambitions are and where we go with them, and starting from there and not with the external pressures. Because everybody will have a view on what we should do next. Everybody will have a view on what recovery should look like. We will have a Tower of Babel of advice. The vocabulary of exhortation will become richer and more extensive. And in these times, we need to be more and more assertive about what our ambitions and priorities are. Because these were all issues before. That's the thinking that we've tried to do at STEP conferences. STEP have been brilliant, apart from me, in the people that they've chosen to talk to you. People like John Jones, you know, people like Claire Lavelle are people who are very clear about realities and importance and what matters. And STEP have continually brought that discussion forward. We need to keep doing it, and we need to keep thinking in context. And by that, I mean we need to think about the diversity of our particular school and what young people will need in it. Different communities have been radically differently affected by this disease. And that means that the schools which serve these communities have experienced just as much difference. And we need to think in context old and new. We need to remember what it was like before. We need to try and have some sense of what it is that we coped with and what we've been coping with and what we will cope with at the other end of this. And all of these messages, which are messages that we've stressed before, we need to hang on to. And we need to remember that this pandemic's not going to be over until it's over. We've had so many false dawns. You know, so many lights at the end of tunnels. And usually we've discovered it's been the train heading towards us. We've no sooner got a vaccination than we've got a new variant. It must be something to do with the V's. And yet, I don't think we're seeing any significant forward thinking or planning around this. I don't think we're seeing a real consideration of what this will mean for us as we move forward. So there's the questions. You know, it's what matters. What are the things that we need to stress and hang on to? When everything appears to be changing, what are the things that will stay the same? And that involves you asking that question about what do you do that matters for the children and families that you work with? Because that's where we draw our strength from. I've always argued that we have too much discussion about resilience and well-being because that allows us to put up with all of the crap that's thrown at us. And actually what we need is not more resilience, we need less crap. And what that means is we've got to be much more assertive around a recognition of what it is that counts. what it is we do that makes a difference. And we need to make sure that we use the forums that we've got. If anybody's been in any doubt, just before we go back, I will just remind you of who I am. I will also remind you of my contact details. I'm going to join in the chat, but I'd be delighted to hear from anybody that wants to continue the discussion or the debate. And let's just remind ourselves of what the lessons are, just before we do that. Let's stress our value. Let's make sure that you record what you've done and what's happened during this period. Let's make sure that we discuss it so we get an idea of the collective experience. Let's make sure that we review and revise, and it'll take time, but let's make sure that we take the time because we need the revision. Let's make sure that we keep the links. It's brilliant that STEP is now, if I might use the phrase, stepping up to the plate in terms of making links and establishing networks again. We need that. We need to make sure that we do that. And we need to use these networks to build a manifesto. We have asked too much of you. And we need to make sure that we have a manifesto which emphasises collective demands. We can never be back here again. We need to identify what the implications are for our training, listing what we need, and we need to think about timings because we need to make our demands and claims when it counts. And all of these things, I think, are vitally important because nothing's changed for me about what makes learning successful. It's still about getting the emotional investment. It's still about getting the engagement. It's still about recognising that if we demonstrate care and interest in our students, then the curriculum is, as Jung described it, so much necessary raw material, but it won't engage on its own. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to follow these key messages, then what we need to do is we need to make sure that we've got the energy to do that. And we need to make sure that along with the black-eyed peas, we recognise that there's a need to feel the love. I'm not going to inflict the Ian Wright video on you, much as I might like to. I just want to go back and say, let's consider care as a strategy for raising attainment. And have we got the energy to care? And if you don't agree with that, then let's talk about what else makes a difference. But ultimately, let's come back to talk about who needs cared for, because I think you do. And as I said earlier, I think well-being, and we hear so much about it, is more the result of tackling what makes you anxious than learning to deal with anxiety. I don't need another lesson in finger breathing. I don't need another lesson on how to, I've been breathing for quite a long time. I think I started in the womb, and I'm not being cynical about that. All of these strategies are helpful in getting us to cope. But actually, we will only get real well-being in the profession when we get job satisfaction. And we'll only get job satisfaction when we fearlessly have the discussions that we've tried to tackle tonight. And it's only when we actually get down to dealing with grids like this and recognise that we have to plot the time and effort that things take against the impact that they have. And if things aren't coming up in the impact end of that graph, then we need to cut back on them and stop doing them. I had a premature slide trailer earlier. I think I'm on to it now. Here's my contact details. Here's who I am and all of that. Delighted to continue the discussion with you. There's my email address, my website, my Twitter handle, and my mobile number. And I'm absolutely genuine about the possibility of contacting around all of this. Because I think, frankly, you deserve that. I think you absolutely deserve that. I think that you've invested so much and you've put so much into this that the least people like me can do is come back and say, if we can help, we will. And it's over to you.
Hello, I'm back. Hi. So we have had a couple of questions through, a few through Menti, and another
Okay.
comments in the chat. So if it's okay, I'll throw at you just a couple of things we've got. I think we've got time for it still. So one of the first questions was, there have been a host of priorities identified for education in lockdown: mental health, maintaining connections, live learning, engagement, life skills. What would yours be?
Right. Okay. The first priority, I think, for me, has to be around getting clarity. You know, that we need to stop throwing priorities at people. Coherence is vital. And for me, it's about teachers having the energy to care. That's what we need. You know, to care for themselves, to care for children, to remain invested in the profession, to remain invested in their development. We know that change comes from teacher agency. People like Mark Priestley are absolutely brilliant around this. They're so consistent around it. And everything else needs to take a second place to that. I think once we get through that, you know, actually, I think support for families and engagement with external bodies and so on, so that we get direct support, I think is hugely important, because we're being left to do too much. And it's like there is an attainment agenda. We just get that stuff all the time, that schools are the one thing that can change the futures of children. That's not the case. You know, so again, it's about getting support around schools would be a priority for me, rather than making demands on teachers.
Okay. So we have another question. Someone has said, would you say this current situation is like David Livingstone's Men Willing to Go and Make Roads Where There Are None, or drawing the cartoons as we watch it, Tom and Jerry style?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that is a bit like what it's felt like. You know, it's felt like people are being asked to make everything up as they go along. And, you know, it is that, you know, in England, they've got this brilliant thing about, you know, you'll provide 5 hours teaching and learning. I mean, holy crap, you know, we can barely manage to do that when we've got some of these kids in. Do you know? I mean, there is absolutely no reality around this. You know, it's this need to recognise the reality that people are coping with. And you know, again, I mean, for me, lots of the stuff that I'm doing tonight, I feel is a bit of a waste of time. You know, I'm going over stuff I've gone over before. I'm making the same points I've gone over before. But I think people need to know they're heard. You know, I think there's a real sense around that people need to have that sense that the reality that you're going through is recognised. That veil of invisibility thing really, really worries me.
I know that Rob had mentioned that in the comments about listening to the profession, and I often think as a classroom teacher, it is difficult to feel like there's a forum for that. And again, about the invisibility, because I feel especially early on in the conversation, there was a lot of but just saying in schools, the children, and there was no recognition that there are staff in schools. And I know that the conversation's very much caught up now and people are more careful to be children and staff, but I think that all fed into that. I think especially at the very beginning of things when people were panicking and all that business. So okay, so I've got one more, I think, and the girls can let me know, the step committee can let me know if there's anything else. So how the synergy between learning and teaching can be more balanced while trying to engage with the new normal.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things I suppose I've been trying to do tonight is trying to, in a sense, challenge this whole idea of a new normal. You know, if it's new, it's not normal. I think that's the key thing, and we do have to have some, you know, some respect for language at least. What I think we need to do is we need to recognise that once we get young people back into schools on a long-term basis, there will be a recovery process. And that will mean that we'll need to think about change. You know, we'll need to think about change and demand. You know, it's fascinating to me that we had all of the, sorry, I don't know if I'm even answering the question any longer, but bear with me. You know, everybody was going mental in August about the exams and the certification debacle. And then when the Priestley report came out in September, I barely found a reference to it. There was absolutely no public debate that I was aware of around the Priestley report. And so it had been like a massive issue in August, and then suddenly it didn't matter once we got the report. And once we got the report, well, that appears to be it, job done. You know, let's just wait till we sod them off again next year. And, you know, instead of sitting saying, what are we going to do to make the best of assessment? And for me, whatever becomes normal needs to reflect on that. You know, we actually need to pick up on this. And one of the things I'm trying to do just now is through the creative conversations that I do in Edinburgh, I'm trying to run a whole series of them, which will pick up on issues like this looking forward. Never waste a good crisis. Can't remember who said that. Never waste a good crisis. You know, we point I'm trying to make tonight is we've had so many things that have been going on for so long and been problems for so long, and in response to it, we got refreshing the narrative. You know, let's have some real genuine change that listens to teachers, that respects teacher agency, and let's all get together and do what we can to build them.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we are going to draw it to a close here. I know there's been some other people in the comments, but you've made your Twitter handle and your email and things available. So, and also obviously the STEP committee would be happy to continue any sort of discussion through Facebook or Twitter and stuff as well. But the only thing I'm going to do now is say thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see you. And just as much as I know you said you had recycled some of this, it's still unbelievably relevant, and I know the people in the comments are saying that just now too, so thank you. And just to the people who are still who are with us this evening, that the STEP committee will be in touch about the upcoming events. Details of that are on the chat just now, and otherwise we hope to see you in person sooner rather than later, hopefully. All right, so thanks very much. Thank you, everybody.
Lots of love, everyone. Bye for now. Bye.